Elira Vance died twice in the same day. The first time her heart simply stopped quietly, without ceremony, on the cold marble floor of a chapel she had bled for. The second time was worse. The second time she opened her eyes and found herself 17 again. Small hands, unscarred palms, 16 years before the world would ever need saving. She was lying in her childhood bed in the healer's quarters of Villainess Castle, moonlight spilling across the same cracked ceiling she used to stare at as a girl, dreaming of being someone's hero. And she remembered everything. She remembered 10 years of starving herself so a prophecy-bound boy could eat. She remembered giving her own blood, her own magic, her own name in whispered prayers so that Cale Ashbourne could stand tall enough to be called chosen. She remembered the night the Demon King's seal finally closed, and how in that same breath, Cale turned to the crowd, took her best friend Sierra's hand instead of hers, and called her the true love his heart had waited for. She remembered dying unthanked, unloved, unnoticed, while the kingdom cheered a lie. Now the moon was young again, the war had not yet begun, and the boy who would break her heart was still just a stable hand nobody believed in. Elira sat up slowly, and for the first time in 2 lifetimes she smiled without kindness in it. "Let's see," she whispered to the dark, "how the story goes when the healer refuses to heal him." The morning after her second birth into the world, Elira Vance did not scream, did not cry, did not run through the castle halls demanding someone believe her. She had learned patience the hard way, in a first life that had asked everything of her and given nothing back. Instead, she sat by her window and watched the sun rise over Villainess the way she used to watch it rise over the same fields as a naive 15-year-old, back when she still believed that being good enough, quiet enough, useful enough, would eventually be rewarded with love. She was 15 now, 15, with the memories of a woman who had lived to 26 and then not lived at all. Her mother knocked twice before entering, the same soft knock Elira remembered from a decade she would now get to live through again. "You look pale, little flame," her mother said, using the nickname the whole healer's ward had given her as a child, because even burned candles gave her comfort, because even in illness she smiled at patients until they forgot to be afraid. "I'm fine, Mama," Elira said, and meant something entirely different by it than her mother could ever guess. She spent that first week simply watching. Watching Cale Ashbourne muck out horse stalls in the lower courtyard, 16 years old, broad-shouldered even then, with that easy laugh that had once made her believe the world could be kind if you only loved hard enough. In her first life, she had met him properly 2 years from now, when the royal augurs discovered the birthmark on his shoulder and declared him the prophesied Sword of Dawn, the one soul strong enough to face the Demon King Mordred when the Ashen War finally came. She remembered how her 15-year-old self had been so thrilled to be assigned as his healer companion, so honored to have been chosen from among dozens of apprentices to walk beside a hero. She remembered how honored feeling had cost her everything. Watching Sierra Nightingale, her best friend since childhood, laughing beside the training yards, still 2 years away from meeting Cale at all, still just the sweet daughter of a minor noble house who braided Elira's hair every night and called her sister of my heart. Elira watched Sierra's easy warmth, her golden laughter, the way people simply loved her without trying, and felt something twist in her chest that was not quite hatred and not quite grief. It was recognition. She had loved this girl. She had died still loving this girl, even as Sierra stood at Cale's side accepting a crown that could have been anyone's but never, in the end, Elira's own. "You've been staring at the yard all morning," said a voice behind her. And Elira didn't need to turn to know it was Rowan, the castle's blind archivist, a man in his first life. She'd barely spoken 20 words to before he died in the second year of the war, killed, doing something small and unrecorded and forgotten. In this life he was younger, sharper-eyed in every way except literally, and something told Elira that history did not have to repeat every single cruelty. "I'm thinking," Elira said carefully, "about the future." "Dangerous pastime for a healer's apprentice," Rowan said, settling beside her with his cane. "Most girls your age think about boys." "I used to," Elira admitted. "I don't anymore." What she did not say was this. In her first life, she had spent 10 years pouring every ounce of her healing gift into Cale Ashbourne's body during training. In battle, in the quiet aftermath of nightmares he never once asked her about in return. She had drained her own aura so many times to keep him breathing that the royal physicians had warned her more than once that her own heart would give out before her 30th year. She had ignored every warning, because Cale had once told her, in a rare unguarded moment beneath a dying campfire, that he did not know what he'd do without her. She had built her entire identity around being necessary to him. And in the final month before the sealing ritual, when Sierra arrived at the war camp to deliver supplies from her father's estate, sweet, warm, uncomplicated Sierra, who had never bled for anyone, who simply existed and was loved for it. Elira had watched Kale's eyes change. She had told herself it meant nothing. She had told herself, even as she gave the final third of her life force to complete the sealing circle that would banish Mordrek, that Kale would remember what she'd sacrificed. That gratitude, at least, would be hers. Instead, the last thing she ever saw in her first life was Kale Ashbourne lifting Syrah's hand to his lips in front of the cheering, weeping Saved Kingdom, declaring that the woman who had believed in him before anyone else did, a title that had always quietly belonged to Elira first, was the only one he wanted beside him now that the war was won. Elira had bled out on the chapel floor 15 feet away, and no one had noticed until the celebration ended. Now, sitting in a body that had not yet given anything to anyone, Elira made herself a promise with the clean, cold clarity of someone who had already paid the most expensive lesson life had to offer. I will not be necessary. I will be powerful. And if the story insists on calling someone a villain for refusing to die quietly in a corner, then fine. Let it call me that. I would rather be feared and alive than beloved and forgotten. She spent the following weeks doing something her first life's version of herself never had time for. She trained. Not in the soft restorative arts the healer's ward taught its girls, but in the older forms of magic the castle's records dismissed as unstable, shadowbinding, the Ashcourt arts that shared their roots uncomfortably with the same magic Mordrek himself commanded. It was magic no respectable healer touched because it asked a price rather than simply giving. It cost sleep. It cost small pieces of memory. It cost comfort. Elira paid gladly. She had comfort to spare from a version of herself the world would never meet again. By the end of the first month, she'd found the entrance to the old Ash Archive beneath the West Tower sealed since before her mother's time, and inside it gathering dust a name she remembered from history lessons that had always been taught as a warning. Nyx Corvillin. The first Ashville queen, a woman the Dawnwarden Order had branded the original villain of Villainess 300 years ago precisely, because she had refused in her own time to die usefully for someone else's prophecy. Elira sat in the dust of that abandoned archive, reading by a shard of captured moonlight, and for the first time since waking up in her own past she laughed, not sadly, not bitterly, but with the giddy, terrified thrill of someone who had just realized the cage she'd been born into had a door nobody had ever tried to open. Teach me, she whispered to a dead queen's journal, how to become someone they can't forget. The pages did not answer, but 3 nights later, when Elira practiced the first Shadow Ward incantation from Nyx's private notes, her candle didn't just flicker. The flame turned black at its heart for exactly 4 seconds before returning to gold, and somewhere deep in the castle, an old ward stone that had slept undisturbed for 300 years let out a single resonant hum, as if something ancient had just opened one eye and noticed her. She did not know yet that the sound had also reached the ears of someone else entirely, someone in the lower dungeons of Villainess whom history remembered only as the sealed prisoner. A man whose real name had been erased from every record in the kingdom for the crime of loving Nyx Corvillin 3 centuries ago and refusing to help destroy her. Elira closed the journal, unaware that her small act of quiet rebellion had just woken something in the foundations of the castle that the Dawnwarden Order had spent 300 years making absolutely certain would never wake again. 2 years passed the way Elira remembered them passing before. The same droughts in the eastern farmlands, the same border skirmishes with the ash-touched creatures crawling out of the veiled forest with increasing hunger. The same slow tightening of dread across Villainess as the royal augurs began whispering that the Ashen War was closer than the last generation had hoped. But this time, Elira watched it all from a very different position. She had not applied to be a battlefield healer. She had not volunteered for the Dawnwarden Order's youth auxiliary the way her first life self had, eager to be useful, eager to matter. Instead, she'd spent those 2 years quietly, dangerously, becoming someone the royal court did not yet know to watch. By 17, Elira could hold a shadow ward long enough to make herself functionally invisible to low-level detection wards for nearly a full minute. By 18, she'd taught herself to read the Ash Court's old script well enough to translate half of Nyx Corvillin's surviving journals, and what she found unsettled her in ways she hadn't expected. Nyx Corvillin had not been a monster. She had been a healer too, once, the finest in her generation, in fact, chosen young to support the hero of her own age, a man named Dorian Thale, whom the histories still called the First Dawn. Nyx had given Dorian 10 years of her strength, her youth, her unconditional devotion. And when the war ended, Dorian had married the daughter of a duke instead, a woman prettier and better connected, and infinitely less complicated than a healer who had bled herself thin, proving her worth. Nyx's crime, according to the official records, was refusing to smile at the wedding. Her crime, according to her own journal, was daring to ask the kingdom for reparation, not revenge. Reparation for 10 years of unpaid, unacknowledged sacrifice. When the kingdom refused and instead began whispering that she'd gone unstable, dangerous, unwell, Nyx had simply stopped asking permission for anything ever again. She built her own court in the veiled forest shadow. She took in the outcasts the Dawnwarden Order discarded, the ash-touched orphans, the discredited mages, the soldiers the war had used up and thrown away. She built power not to destroy Virelane, but so that Virelane would never again be able to treat someone the way it had treated her. The Order called her the Ashville Queen and hunted her for 11 years before finally cornering her, sealing her into the same prison beneath the West Tower where, Elira now suspected, something had stirred the night she'd read that first incantation. She wasn't a villain, Elira murmured to herself, sitting once again in the dust of the archive, now 18 years old and infinitely more dangerous than the girl who'd first found this room. She was just a woman who stopped performing gratitude for people who never intended to pay her back. It was in that same week that Cale Ashbourne's birthmark was finally discovered. The same jagged silver mark along his left shoulder blade that the prophecy described, revealed by pure accident when a training injury tore his shirt during a sparring match in the lower yard. Elira remembered the exact moment from her first life. The way the entire castle had erupted into celebration, the way Cale's stable-hand mother had wept with pride, the way Elira herself, 18 and hopeful, had been so thrilled to be assigned as his personal healer that she'd cried tears of joy in front of the whole order. This time when the announcement came, Elira was in the archive translating a passage about void anchoring, and she simply raised an eyebrow. Elira. Sira burst into the healer's ward that evening, breathless with excitement, gold hair coming loose from its braid, eyes shining the exact way Elira remembered from a decade she'd rather forget. "Did you hear? They found him, the Sword of Dawn, it's Cale from the stables. Can you believe it? We practically grew up around him." "I heard," Elira said, setting down the ledger she'd been pretending to update. "The Order's already forming his companion team, best healer apprentices, sword masters, everything." Sira perched on the edge of Elira's desk, the way she'd done 1,000 times in childhood, utterly unaware that this exact conversation had once ended with Elira dead on a chapel floor 8 years from now. "You should apply. You're the best healer in our year, everyone says so." Imagine Elira being part of history. In her first life, Elira had applied that same night, staying up until dawn perfecting her petition letter, desperate to be chosen, desperate to matter to something bigger than herself. This time, Elira looked at her best friend's hopeful, shining face and felt something that was almost tenderness, almost grief curdle into resolve. "I don't think I will," Elira said quietly. Sira blinked. "What? Why not? This is everything you've ever wanted." "It was," Elira agreed. "It isn't anymore." She didn't explain further, and Sira, confused but too kind to push, eventually let the subject drop, chattering instead about which of the sword masters she thought was handsome, and whether Cale remembered them from childhood summers spent racing through the castle orchards. Elira listened, nodded in the right places, and felt the strange vertigo of watching someone she loved walk unknowingly toward a fate that had once destroyed her. Because she did remember something crucial that even Sira didn't know yet. In her first life, it had not been instant. Cale had not fallen for Sira immediately. For the first 6 years of the war, he had genuinely, deeply needed Elira, leaned on her, confided in her, called her his anchor in every letter home. The shift had only happened slowly in the final 2 years, as exhaustion and grief wore down the boy he'd been into someone who craved simplicity, ease, a version of love that didn't require him to see his own weaknesses reflected back at him. Elira had been his mirror. Sira had been his rest. Understanding that now, with 8 years of hindsight compressed into a single cold, clear thought, Elira realized something that changed the shape of everything she planned to do next. If she refused to be his healer at all, someone else would take her place. The war would still come, Mordrek would still rise, and without her particular strength holding the front lines together the way she once had, more people would die who hadn't died before. Rowan, perhaps. Others whose names she barely remembered from the First War's endless casualty lists. She could not simply walk away and let the story happen without her. But she also refused, utterly, finally refused, to walk the same road as before, the one where devotion was mistaken for weakness and cost her everything she had. There was a third path. She had spent 2 years finding it in a dead queen's journals. She would help win the war. She would even, if it served her purposes, stand near Cale Ashbourne on the battlefield. But she would not do it as his healer, dependent on his notice, his gratitude, his eventual love as payment for her sacrifice. She would do it as something the Dawnwarden Order didn't have a category for yet, a power unto herself, owing loyalty to no prophecy, answering to no crown, feared enough that no one would ever again think they could discard her without consequence. I'm going to apply for something else, Elira told Sira finally, watching her friend's confused face carefully. Something the Order doesn't officially recognize yet. What does that mean? Elira smiled, and even she could feel that it wasn't quite the smile Sira remembered from their childhood anymore. You'll see, she said, everyone will. That night she returned to the archive one last time, retrieved Nyx Corvellin's final unfinished journal entry, and read the Queen's last written words by candlelight, the black-hearted flame steady now obedient hers. If they will not thank me for saving them, then let them fear what happens when I stop trying to be saved by their gratitude at all. Elira closed the book, and for the first time in 2 lifetimes she went looking not for a hero to serve, but for a prisoner to free. The West Tower dungeon had not been opened in 300 years, and it showed. Elira descended the spiral stairs alone, past rust-frozen gates and wards so old their magic had curdled into something closer to rot than protection. Her black-hearted candle the only light in a darkness that seemed to remember exactly how long it had been waiting. She found him in the last cell, chained not with iron but with a binding circle carved directly into stone. A man who did not look 300 years old because the same magic that imprisoned him had also stopped him from aging a single day since. His hair was dark, threaded with silver at the temples the way grief sometimes does that job faster than time. His eyes, when they opened at the sound of her footsteps, were a pale, startled gray. "You're not one of them," he said, voice rough from centuries of disuse. "You're not wearing their colors." "No," Elira agreed, crouching just outside the binding circle's edge. "I'm not." "Then why are you here, girl? No one comes here. No one is supposed to remember I exist." "I found your queen's journals," Elira said simply, "Nyx Corvellin S. I've read all of them. I know what the Order did to her, and I think," she paused, choosing her next words with the precision of someone laying the first stone of a very long bridge. "I think I'm about to become exactly the kind of woman they'll want to lock away next." Something in the prisoner's face cracked open, not hope, not yet, but something adjacent to it, something that had been waiting 300 years for permission to exist again. "My name is Aldrich," he said finally. "I was her sword master, her friend, before I was anything else. When the Order came to seal her, they gave me a choice: help them and live free, refuse and share her fate." His mouth twisted, not quite a smile. "I refused. It turns out sharing her fate simply meant a different cell in the same tower, and 300 years to consider whether I'd choose the same thing twice. Would you?" "Every single time," Aldrich said without hesitation, and something about the certainty in his voice made Elira's throat tighten in a way she hadn't expected. She thought of Kale, of 10 years given freely and repaid with a wedding toast to someone else. She thought of what it might have meant in her first life to have had even one person willing to share her fate instead of simply accepting the reward for abandoning her to it. "I want to break your binding circle," Elira said. "But I need to understand what happened first, not the version in the Order's records, the truth." Aldrich told her, over the following hour, a story that matched what she'd already pieced together from the journals, but filled in the parts a woman writing in private grief could never have known to include about her own downfall. Nyx Corvellin had not simply been abandoned by Dorian Thale after the war. She had been actively hunted afterward. Because the Dawnwarden Order's founding elders had realized something uncomfortable. A healer powerful enough to single-handedly keep a hero alive through a war was also powerful enough to expose exactly how much unpaid, uncredited labor the entire prophecy system was built on. Nyx hadn't wanted revenge. She had wanted the Order to formally acknowledge, in their own records, precisely what she and women like her contributed to every Chosen One's victory. The Order had found that demand more threatening than any army Mordrek's predecessor had ever raised. "They didn't seal her because she was dangerous," Aldrich said quietly. "They sealed her because she was inconvenient. A grateful hero is easy to build a religion around. A woman asking to be paid what she's owed is not." Elira sat with that for a long moment, feeling the shape of her own first death settle into a context far larger and far older than she'd realized. It wasn't just Kale who had failed her. It was an entire structure, 300 years deep, built specifically to make sure women like her and Nyx quietly disappeared the moment their usefulness ended and their inconvenience began. "I'm going to need allies," Elira said finally. "People the Order has discarded. People who understand exactly what I'm about to do and why." "And what precisely," Aldrich asked, "are you about to do?" Elira stood, brushing 300 years of dust from her knees, and looked at the binding circle with the clear-eyed calculation of a girl who'd spent 2 years teaching herself exactly this kind of magic. I'm going to win their war, she said. And then I'm going to make them pay every debt they've been avoiding for 3 centuries, starting with yours. She began the unbinding that same night, tracing the counter-sigils from Nyx's journal with hands that did not shake despite the very real possibility that breaking a 300-year order seal might trigger every alarm ward in the castle above them. Aldrich watched her work in silence, occasionally offering a correction from memory that made the process faster, safer, more precise than anything Elira could have managed alone. The final sigil closed at the stroke of midnight. The binding circle didn't shatter dramatically. It simply exhaled, a long, slow breath of released pressure, and went dark. Aldrich stepped across the boundary that had held him for 300 years and did not immediately fall to his knees in gratitude, did not weep, did not perform the kind of relief Elira had half expected. Instead, he rolled his shoulders once, testing muscles that had been frozen in stasis for 3 centuries, and looked at her with an expression she recognized instantly because she'd worn it herself, staring into a mirror after her own second waking. It was the look of someone recalculating an entire life's plan from the ground up. 300 years, he said, and no one thought to check if the seal still held, careless. He looked toward the stairs leading up toward the castle proper, toward the order that had buried him alive and forgotten to keep watching the grave. Do they even remember I exist, girl? No, Elira said. The records call you the sealed prisoner. Not even your name survived. Something sharp and old passed behind Aldrich's gray eyes. Then let's make sure, he said quietly, that when this is finished, they never forget either of our names again. They were 3 steps toward the stairwell when the alarm ward finally caught up to what had happened. Not the ward on Aldrich's cell long since decayed and useless, but a secondary ward buried in the tower's foundation, stones one neither of them had known to look for. One that had waited 300 years for exactly this moment to finally quietly wake the entire Dawnwarden order, to the fact that something ancient and dangerous had just been set free beneath their own castle. Somewhere above them, a bell that hadn't rung in 3 centuries began, impossibly, to toll. The Dawnwarden Order convened an emergency council within the hour, and Elira Vance walked into the Great Hall at 19 years old alone, without an escort, precisely as the ancient bell's echo was still fading from the stones. You, said Elder Castellan Voss, no relation, despite the shared name, a coincidence Elira had noted with grim amusement in her first life too, will explain immediately why the West Tower's deepest seal has been broken on the same night you were seen entering that tower. The Great Hall had gone utterly silent. Sira stood near the back with the other healer apprentices, face pale with confusion and worry. Cale Ashbourne, only recently confirmed as the prophesied Sword of Dawn, stood near the front with his newly assigned companion team. Watching Elira with an expression she couldn't quite read, not fear yet, but something curious unsettled the way you'd watch a familiar road suddenly reveal a turn you never noticed before. I freed a man your order buried alive for 300 years for the crime of loyalty, Elira said clearly, letting her voice carry to every corner of the hall. His name is Aldrich. He was Nyx Corvellin's swordmaster. He refused to help you seal a woman whose only true crime was asking to be paid for saving your kingdom. The murmur that swept the hall was immediate and furious, but Elira had expected fury. She had planned for it. You dare speak the Asheville Queen's name with sympathy? Elder Voss's voice cracked like a whip. She nearly destroyed this kingdom out of jealous spite. She destroyed nothing, Elira cut in, and something in her tone, flat, certain, utterly unafraid, made even the elder pause. She healed your hero for 10 years and asked in return only that his victory be recorded honestly, crediting the woman who made it possible. You called that treason. You sealed her for it. And then you buried the man who loved her enough to refuse helping you do it, and erased his name so thoroughly that not even the records remember he exists. And what is your interest in ancient history, apprentice? Elder Voss's eyes narrowed. Unless you intend to walk the same path she did. Elira let the silence stretch for exactly 3 seconds before she answered, long enough for everyone in the hall to feel the weight of what she was about to say. I intend, she said, to walk a path this order has never seen before because the women who tried it before me were always alone. I won't be. She raised her hand, and the black-hearted flame she'd practiced for 2 years bloomed above her palm, not a large display, not a threat, simply a demonstration, controlled and deliberate, of exactly the kind of power the Order had spent 3 centuries pretending it had successfully exterminated. The hall erupted, guards moved. Cale, Elira noted with distant, clinical interest, took 1 step forward before catching himself, his hand halfway to the sword at his hip, his eyes fixed on her with an expression that was no longer merely curious. Enough. A new voice cut through the chaos, Rowan, the blind archivist, stepping forward from where he'd been quietly observing near the council's side chamber, his cane tapping once against the stone floor for emphasis. Before this council does something the historical record will regret for another 300 years, perhaps someone should ask why the girl who just demonstrated forbidden magic is also the same apprentice healer who scored highest in her year on every diagnostic and restorative examination the Order has ever administered. Elder Voss's glare didn't soften, but he hesitated. "What is your point, Archivist?" "My point," Rowan said, "is that you are about to imprison on the same night the Sword of Dawn has finally been confirmed. The single most talented healer this Order has produced in a generation, for the crime of freeing an innocent man and demonstrating a magic she has apparently mastered without a single documented incident of harm to anyone in this kingdom. I would think, given the war approaching, that the Order might prefer to negotiate rather than martyr yet another gifted young woman into a legend her descendants will use against you in another 300 years. The silence that followed was different from the fury before it, calculating, uncertain, the sound of an institution suddenly aware it might be standing on ground far less stable than it had assumed. "What?" Elder Voss said finally through gritted teeth. "Do you want Elira Vance?" Elira had rehearsed this moment for 2 years in the dark of an abandoned archive, and she delivered it now without a single tremor in her voice. "Recognition," she said, "not as a healer bound to serve whoever the prophecy names important. Recognition as an independent battle mage, answerable to the Order's laws but not its ownership, permitted to fight in the coming war on my own terms, with my own allies under my own name. In exchange, I offer you my power against Mordrek when the time comes, freely given, not extracted through obligation. And if we refuse," Elira smiled, and it was not a healer's smile at all. "Then I suppose," she said softly, "you'll face the Ashen War the same way you nearly lost the last one without me." Elder Voss's jaw tightened, calculating war costs against pride, tradition against necessity. And in the tense silence that followed, Elira caught Kale's eyes across the hall one final time. He was staring at her the way you'd stare at a stranger wearing a face you thought you knew. And beneath the confusion, unmistakably, something that looked disturbingly close to fascination. Behind him, Syrah's face had gone pale with something Elira recognized instantly and felt, despite everything, a small ache of genuine grief over. Fear. Her best friend was looking at her with fear. The council's decision would not come until dawn. But as Elira turned to leave the hall that night, she understood with absolute clarity that the story had already irrevocably changed course, and that she would need every ally, every ounce of power, and every hard lesson from a life she'd already lost once. To survive walking the road she'd just chosen in front of the entire kingdom. The Order granted Elira's petition by dawn, though granted was perhaps too generous a word for the grudging, heavily conditioned agreement Elder Voss finally signed. She would be permitted to fight independently under probation, monitored by a council-appointed liaison, with the unspoken understanding that any misstep would see her sealed beside Aldrich before the ink dried on her release. She didn't care about the conditions. She cared that for the first time in either of her lives, her name existed in an Order ledger not as healer, assigned to the Sword of Dawn's companion team, but as Elira Vance, independent battle mage. A small distinction. It felt to her like the first true breath she'd taken in 8 years. The war's opening skirmishes began within the month. Exactly as Elira remembered, ash-touched creatures pouring out of the veiled forest's northern edge in numbers too large to be coincidence. A sure sign that Mordrek's influence was stirring earlier than the Order's augurs had predicted. Kale's companion team was dispatched to the border village of Hallowmere, and Elira, now formally independent, arrived at the same battlefield through her own arrangement with Aldrich at her side, and 2 other allies she'd spent the month quietly recruiting. A discredited Ashcourt scholar named Pet, exiled from the Order's academy for unorthodox theories, and a former soldier named Finch who'd lost his family to a border raid the Order's official forces had arrived too late to prevent. The battle at Hallowmere was chaos from the first horn blast, ashwolves twice the size of any recorded specimen, moving with a coordinated intelligence that unsettled even the Order's veteran commanders. Elira watched Kale fight for the first time since her second life began. And something in her chest twisted painfully at how familiar it was. The same reckless courage, the same instinctive drive to place himself between danger and anyone weaker, the same exhausted, determined set of his jaw as the battle wore past its first hour. She had loved that version of him once. Perhaps some small, stubborn corner of her still did. That didn't change anything about the decision she'd already made. When a wave of ashwolves broke through the eastern flank, cutting off a cluster of Order soldiers from the main formation, Elira didn't hesitate. She moved with Aldrich flanking her, weaving shadow wards that confused the creature's ash sense, buying Finch precious seconds to pull the trapped soldiers back to safety. It wasn't the kind of healing magic anyone expected from her. It was sharper, stranger, more aggressive magic that didn't just protect but actively unmade the threat in front of it. By the time the horn sounded retreat and the ash wolves finally withdrew back into the tree line, Elira had personally saved 11 soldiers who would have died in her first life's version of this exact skirmish. She felt the weight of that number settle into her chest like a small, private victory no one else would ever fully understand. That was, Cale appeared at her side as the field cleared, blood and ash streaked across his jaw, his sword still drawn, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her skin prickle uncomfortably with memory. Elira, I didn't know you could do that, any of that. There's a lot you don't know about me, Cale, she said, cleaning ash residue from her hands with brisk, businesslike movements that gave nothing away. We grew up together. His voice had an edge of something almost hurt in it, and despite everything, despite 2 lives worth of hard-won resolve, Elira felt the familiar tug of wanting to soften for him, to explain herself, to make him understand. She recognized the impulse instantly for what it was: old habit, old wound, old hunger for his approval, and set it firmly aside. We did, she agreed. And in all that time, did you ever once ask what I actually wanted, Cale? Or only what I could do for you? He didn't have an answer for that, she hadn't expected him to. Sira found her an hour later, in the healer's tent where Elira had gone to help tend the wounded despite her new independent status. Old habits, she admitted privately, dying harder than she'd like. Her best friend's face was drawn with an exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical labor. You scared me today, Sira said quietly, sitting on the edge of a supply crate watching Elira work. That magic, Elira, that's Ashcourt magic, isn't it? The kind they say Mordrek's forces use. It's older than Mordrek, Elira said, not looking up from the wound she was cleaning. It belonged to a woman named Nyx Corvellin first. She used it to protect people. So do I, but the Order says. The Order says a great many things, Sira, that happen to be extremely convenient for the Order. Elira finally met her friend's eyes, and something in her own gaze must have carried more of her true exhaustion than she intended. Because Sira's expression softened from fear into something more complicated, worry genuine and old, and rooted in 18 years of friendship that predated any prophecy or war. I don't understand what's happening to you, Sira admitted. You've changed since I don't even know when. You used to want nothing more than to be chosen for something like this. Now you're standing outside the whole system, fighting it as much as fighting for it. What happened, Elira? What am I missing? Elira looked at her oldest friend, the girl who would. In another version of this story, stand at Cale's side, accepting a crown that Elira had bled for, and felt the strange vertigo of loving someone completely while also quietly structurally no longer trusting the story that bound them together. I learned something, Elira said finally, carefully. About what happens to women who give everything and wait patiently to be thanked for it. I decided I'd rather learn that lesson once, on my own terms, than have it taught to me the hard way by people who never intended to pay their debts. That sounds like something happened to you, Sira said slowly. Something specific. Maybe it did, Elira said, and did not elaborate further because the truth, I died watching you take my place at his side. And no one even noticed I was gone until the celebration ended. Was not a wound she was ready to hand her best friend, not yet, not when Sira hadn't done anything wrong yet in this timeline, not when the crime hadn't even been committed. It was Rowan who found Elira later that night, staring into the dying campfire with an expression he could not see but somehow uncannily always seemed to sense anyway. You're troubled, he said, settling beside her. I saved 11 people today who died in. Elira caught herself before finishing the sentence, before saying the word that would unravel everything. I saved 11 people today, she said instead. It should feel like enough, but it does. Cale looked at me today like he'd never really seen me before, Elira admitted quietly. And some old, stupid part of me wanted that more than I want to admit. Rowan was quiet for a long moment, the fire crackling between them. Wanting to be seen isn't the same as needing to be necessary, he said finally. The first is human. The second is the trap that killed the woman whose journals you've been reading. Learn the difference, Elira, before the war teaches it to you at a cost you can't afford twice. Elira didn't answer because far across the camp at that exact moment she could see Cale sitting near his own fire, not with his companion team not resting, but staring in her direction with an expression that had absolutely no business existing this early in the story, an expression she remembered only from the final desperate months of her first life, a look she'd once mistaken fatally for love. Something about seeing it now, years ahead of schedule, felt less like victory and far more like warning. The following 2 years compressed the slow, grinding shape of war into a rhythm Elira remembered too well, village skirmishes escalating into full battles. The Order's forces stretched thinner with every season, Mordrek's ash-touched armies growing bolder as something deep in the veiled forest continued to stir. But this time, Elira fought every battle with allies who trusted her completely, with a reputation that grew from feared curiosity into something closer to grudging respect, and with a private cause that had nothing to do with anyone's prophecy. She had spent those 2 years also quietly investigating something that troubled her more each month. The strange, specific way Elder Castellan Voss reacted whenever Nyx Corvellin's name came up in council. Not the generic disapproval of a man citing forbidden history, but something sharper, more personal, almost guilty. It was Petra, the exiled Ashcourt scholar, who finally uncovered the truth buried in records the Order had never intended anyone to cross-reference. Elira. Petra found her in the war camp archive tent one evening, her face pale, a stack of borrowed records clutched to her chest. "I need you to look at this." The document was a birth registry from 340 years ago, before Nyx Corvellin's war, before Dorian Thale's prophecy, before any of the history Elira thought she understood. It listed the founding elders of the Dawnwarden Order, the men who had first codified the laws governing chosen ones and their companions. One name appeared on both that ancient registry and, impossibly, on the modern council roster Elira had memorized during her petition hearing 2 years earlier. Castellan Voss. "That's not possible," Elira said, staring at the parchment. "That's over 300 years. It's not the same man," Petra said, "or it is and it is. Elira, I think Elder Voss isn't human anymore. I think he's been sustaining himself for over 3 centuries using something Ashcourt adjacent, something forbidden even by his own order's laws. I think he's the reason Nyx was sealed instead of negotiated with. I think he's the one who's kept this exact cycle running, generation after generation. Find a hero, extract a healer's devotion until she becomes inconvenient, discard her. Silence anyone who objects, repeat." Elira sat back slowly, feeling pieces of a much larger, much older puzzle sliding into terrible alignment. "Why?" she asked. "What does he gain from any of this?" "Control," Aldrich said grimly, having listened from the tent's entrance. "A hero who owes everything to a prophecy and nothing to a living person is easy to direct. A hero who's genuinely, mutually bonded to someone with real independent power, someone like Nyx, someone like you, is not. Voss doesn't sabotage these romances out of moral judgment, Elira. He does it because a hero in love with someone powerful in her own right is a hero who might start asking whose interests the Order actually serves." The revelation sat heavy in Elira's chest for days. It reframed everything: her own first death, Nyx's 300-year imprisonment, the entire architecture of a war she'd once believed was simply the tragic cost of prophecy. It had never been about prophecy at all. It had been about control, maintained across centuries by a man who had learned exactly how to make devotion look like destiny and discard look like romance's natural evolution. "Does Cale know?" Elira asked finally. "I doubt it," Rowan said, joining the conversation with the quiet certainty of a man who had spent his entire career reading between an institution's carefully curated lines. Voss wouldn't need Cale's knowledge, only his obedience. And obedience, historically, has been very easy to secure from exhausted young heroes desperate for someone simple to love. Elira thought of Sira then, sweet, uncomplicated, entirely blameless Sira, who had done nothing in either lifetime except exist warmly and be loved for it. It would be easy, so easy, to resent her for a role she hadn't chosen and likely didn't even understand she was being positioned to fill. Elira found, to her own surprise, that she couldn't quite manage the resentment. Whatever else was true, Sira was also being used by the same 300-year machine that had used Elira, that had used Nyx, that would use whoever came after them if nobody finally broke the pattern. "We're not enemies," Elira murmured to herself that night, watching Sira laugh with the other healer apprentices across the war camp, radiant and unaware. "We're both being fed to the same fire. I just refuse to let it eat me twice." It was 3 nights later that Cale found Elira alone at the edge of the camp, away from the fires, staring up at a sky thick with more stars than the smoke-choked cities ever showed. "Can I ask you something?" he said, settling beside her without quite asking permission, close enough that she felt the old, familiar warmth of him and hated just slightly how automatic her body's response to his presence still was. "You usually do anyway," Elira said. Cale huffed something that wasn't quite a laugh. 2 years ago, you were the girl who braided flowers into Sira's hair and cried during festival plays. Now you're the most feared independent mage in 3 kingdoms, and half the order still isn't sure if you're an asset or a threat. He turned to look at her fully, and there was something raw in his expression that made Elira's carefully maintained composure waver, just slightly, just for a moment. I think about you more than I should, Elira. More than makes any sense, given how little time we actually spend together anymore. I don't understand it, I don't know what to do with it. Elira's heart did something complicated and unwelcome in her chest, a flicker of the old hunger, the old hope. The girl who had once given everything for exactly this kind of attention, rising up despite 2 lifetimes of hard-won wisdom. She breathed through it, deliberately, the way she'd trained herself to breathe through every Ashward incantation that asked more of her than was comfortable to give. Kale, she said finally, gently but without softness, I need you to understand something clearly, because I don't think anyone has ever told you this honestly before. What you're feeling right now isn't really about me. It's about the fact that I'm the first person in your life who's never needed anything from you, not your gratitude, not your love, not your attention. That's rare, it's disorienting. It feels like something profound. But it isn't the same thing as actually knowing me or actually choosing me over the comfortable, easy love that's still waiting for you exactly where it's always been. You think I'll still choose Sira, Kale said quietly. It wasn't quite a question. I think, Elira said, standing. Brushing grass from her knees with the same brisk finality she'd used 2 years earlier to clean ash residue from her hands after her first battle. That whatever you choose needs to happen without me standing here waiting to be selected like a prize at the end of it. I've already lived a life built around being necessary to someone else's story, Kale. I'm not living that life again. She left him sitting alone beneath the stars, and if some small, stubborn, wounded part of her wanted to look back and see his face, she didn't allow herself the indulgence. She had barely returned to her own tent when Aldrich intercepted her, his expression grim in a way that told her the night's revelations weren't finished yet. Elira, Elder Voss has summoned an emergency council, effective immediately. His gray eyes were hard. Someone told him about the birth registry Petra found. He knows we know what he is. Elira felt the cold, clean clarity of a fight finally arriving at the doorstep she'd spent 2 years building. Then it's time, she said, to stop playing his game by his rules. The emergency council convened at midnight, and this time it was Elder Voss who arrived flanked by guards, his expression carved from something colder than the fury he displayed 2 years earlier. Elira walked in with Aldrich, Petra, and Rowan at her side, and for the first time since her second life began, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of exactly how dangerous this confrontation was about to become. You've been digging where you were explicitly warned not to dig, Voss said without preamble, his voice carrying an authority that Elira now understood was propped up by 300 years of carefully maintained fear. Birth registries are sealed for a reason, Elira Vance. 340 years is a long time to keep pretending to be mortal, Elder, Elira said calmly, letting the accusation land in front of the full assembled council, where Kale and Sira and dozens of other witnesses could hear it plainly. Long enough, certainly, to perfect a system for making sure every generation's Nyx Corvellin gets discarded before she can ask uncomfortable questions about who actually benefits from the Order's prophecies. The hall went utterly silent. You have no proof of any such. I have a birth registry with your name on it, Elira cut in, 340 years before your supposed date of appointment. I have journal after journal from a woman your Order branded a villain for asking to be paid fairly for saving this kingdom. And I have. She added, letting her voice drop into something quieter, more dangerous. A very strong suspicion that Mordrek's rise to power every generation isn't a random cosmic tragedy at all, but something your Order has been quietly, deliberately cultivating. Because a kingdom perpetually terrified of an ash-touched demon king is a kingdom that will forgive absolutely anything the Dawnwarden Order does in the name of saving it. Voss's composure cracked for exactly 1 visible second, long enough for the entire hall to see it, long enough for Kale's face to shift from confusion into something colder and more focused than Elira had ever seen him wear. That's absurd, Voss said too quickly. Is it? Rowan's voice was quiet but carried easily through the stunned silence. I've spent 30 years cataloging this Order's records, Elder Voss. Every single Ashen War in our recorded history began within a decade of the previous generation's healer being discarded, discredited, or eliminated. Every single one. That's not prophecy, Elder, that's pattern. And patterns, unlike prophecies, are made by someone. You're suggesting, Kale said slowly, stepping forward for the first time, his voice carrying a barely controlled fury that made even Voss's guards shift uneasily, that Mordrek isn't some ancient cosmic evil at all. You're suggesting he's what? Manufactured. summoned deliberately to keep this order in power. I'm suggesting, Elira said, meeting Kale's eyes directly for the first time since their conversation beneath the stars, that someone should ask Elder Voss directly where precisely. The ash corruption in the Veiled Forest originates from every single generation right on schedule exactly when the Order's authority begins to feel too comfortable to challenge. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Elira had ever heard. Voss's mask, 300 years in the making, finally began to slip. You understand nothing, he said, and his voice had changed, lower, older, carrying an echo that didn't belong to any mortal throat. Do you think chaos simply happens on its own, girl? Do you think a kingdom governs itself peacefully without a threat large enough to make its people grateful for whatever protection they're offered? I didn't create Mordrek out of cruelty. I created him out of necessity. A world without a monster at its border is a world that stops needing heroes. And a world that stops needing heroes very quickly stops needing an order to manage them. The confession, delivered in front of the full assembled council, in front of Kale, in front of Sira, in front of dozens of witnesses who would carry the story out of this hall by morning regardless of what happened next, changed everything. You've been feeding an entire kingdom to a war you manufactured, Elira said, feeling something in her chest that was not quite triumph and not quite grief, for 300 years. Nyx Corvellin didn't threaten your order because she was dangerous. She threatened it because she nearly figured out exactly what you just admitted. And you will share her fate, Voss said, his form beginning to shift, the mortal disguise he'd maintained for 3 centuries finally cracking under the weight of exposure, revealing something ash-touched and old and hungry beneath it, the moment I finish what I started with her. The hall erupted into chaos as Voss's guards moved as council members scrambled for the exits. As the ancient thing wearing an elder's face for 300 years finally revealed the true shape of the enemy Elira had actually been fighting since the moment she woke up in her 15-year-old body, with a dead woman's journals waiting to be found. Kale moved first, sword already drawn, placing himself instinctively between the transforming elder and the assembled council. The same reflexive courage Elira remembered from every battlefield she'd ever watched him fight on. But this time, for the first time in either of her lives, Elira didn't wait behind him, didn't position herself as support, didn't measure her own worth by how well she could keep him standing. She moved beside him instead, shadow wards already blooming from her palms, Aldrich at her other flank, Petra and Finch, converging from the hall's edges with the precision of allies who had trained for exactly this moment. 300 years, Elira said, voice carrying clear and cold across the chaos. And you thought no one would ever be strong enough to stand against you and still have allies left standing beside them when the fighting started. Voss's true form, something vast and ash-black and ancient, wearing the remnants of a human elder's robes like a discarded costume, turned toward her with eyes that held 3 centuries of carefully managed cruelty. Nyx also believed she had allies, he said, voice now entirely inhuman, echoing through the stone hall like something spoken from the bottom of a very old well. It did not save her. Nyx, Elira said, drawing on every hour of training, every page of a dead queen's journals, every ounce of hard-won clarity from a life she'd already lost once and refused to lose the same way twice. Was alone, I'm not. Around her, Kale, Aldrich, Petra, Finch, and stepping forward with a determined expression that surprised absolutely everyone watching. Sira Nightingale, unarmed but resolute, formed a circle around the transformed elder, and the true battle for the soul of the Dawnwarden Order finally, after 300 years, began. The battle in the council hall lasted less than 20 minutes, but it reshaped Elira's understanding of everyone around her in ways that would outlast the fight itself by years. Voss, freed of his mortal disguise, fought with the accumulated cruelty of 3 centuries, ash-black tendrils tearing through stone pillars, guards, and council furniture with equal indifference. But he had spent those same 3 centuries relying on fear rather than genuine strength, on the assumption that no one would ever gather the specific combination of allies necessary to challenge him directly. He had not accounted for a healer who'd spent 2 years mastering forbidden magic, specifically to counter exactly his kind of ancient cruelty. He had not accounted for a sword master who'd spent 300 years in stasis with nothing to do but perfect his form in memory alone. He had not accounted for an exiled scholar whose unorthodox theories turned out to be devastatingly accurate battle magic, or a grieving soldier whose fury had been sharpened rather than dulled by loss. And he had certainly not accounted for Sira Nightingale, unarmed and untrained in combat. Throwing herself directly into the path of a killing blow meant for Elira, not out of any prophecy or destiny, but out of 18 years of friendship that refused, even now, even confused and frightened, as she was to simply stand aside and watch her sister of the heart die. Sira, Elira's voice cracked with a fear that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with a bond 300 years of manufactured wars had never quite managed to erase. The blow that should have killed Sira instead struck a shadow ward Elira through with a speed and desperation she hadn't known she still possessed. The same instinctive unconditional devotion she, once poured entirely into Kale redirected in this life in this moment. Toward protecting the friend she'd spent 2 years quietly privately resenting for a crime that hadn't even happened yet. Sira stared at her, breathless, alive, tears cutting clean tracks through ash dust on her face. "You saved me," she said, stunned. "After everything, after how strange I've been about you, how frightened you still, you're my sister," Elira said simply, hauling her friend back from the fighting's edge. "That was never the part of the story I wanted to change." The moment cost Elira precious seconds. And Voss used them, a lash of ash-corrupted power catching her across the shoulder hard enough to send her sprawling hard enough that for one long suspended moment, she felt the same creeping cold she remembered from her first death. The same terrible sense of a story ending exactly as badly as it had before. Kale reached her first, sword already swinging to intercept the follow-up strike Voss aimed at her exposed position. And for one desperate, chaotic moment, the entire battle seemed to hinge on whether the Sword of Dawn's raw courage could buy Elira the seconds she needed to recover. He bought her those seconds. He bled for them, a deep gash opening along his forearm, but he held the line long enough for Aldrich to drive Voss back, long enough for Petra's counterward to weaken the ancient elder's ash form. Long enough for Elira to push herself up from the shattered council floor with fire, literal black-hearted fire, building in her palms. "I told you once," Elira said, rising unsteadily but with absolute purpose, facing the thing that had orchestrated 300 years of manufactured suffering, "that I would rather be feared and alive than beloved and forgotten. I think it's time you learned exactly what that means." The killing strike, when it came, was not simple violence. It was the full weight of everything Nyx Corvellin had died trying to prove, everything Elira had spent 2 lifetimes learning the hard way. Poured into a single devastating shadow ward that didn't simply attack Voss's corrupted form, but unmade the specific magic sustaining his 300-year masquerade entirely, stripping away not his life, but his lie, exposing to the entire assembled council, in permanent undeniable magical record, every manufactured war, every discarded healer. Every cruelty he'd orchestrated across 3 centuries of careful patient control. Voss did not die from Elira's strike, he simply stopped being able to hide. What remained, collapsed and diminished on the shattered council floor, was not a demon, not an ancient monster, but a very old, very frightened man who had spent so long manufacturing fear that he had genuinely forgotten how to survive without it. "Please," he said, voice human again, stripped of every ounce of the authority he'd hoarded for 300 years. "The kingdom needs the order needs the fear, without it everything collapses." "No," Elira said, and her voice for the first time in the entire confrontation carried something almost like mercy. "The kingdom needs honesty. It's had quite enough of what you've been calling protection." The council hall stood in stunned silence around them, Kale bleeding but standing. Sira clutching Elira's arm with trembling hands, Aldrich and Petra and Finch, forming a protective line around a truth 300 years in the making and dozens of witnesses, who would carry this exact story out of these walls by morning. Regardless of whatever the surviving Order elders tried to do to contain it. "What happens now?" Sira asked quietly, still holding tight to Elira's arm, the way she'd held on through every childhood storm the two of them had ever weathered together. Elira looked around the shattered hall, at Kale watching her, with an expression that had finally completely shed every trace of the desperate fascination he'd carried for the past 2 years, replaced now with something steadier, more honest. More like genuine respect than anything resembling the old fairy tale devotion either of them had once mistaken for love. At Sira, alive, present, choosing loyalty even when frightened. At Aldrich, finally free not just of his 300-year prison, but of the entire corrupt system that had built it. At Rowan, standing quietly at the hall's edge with the particular stillness of a man who had spent 30 years waiting for exactly this moment of vindication. "Now," Elira said, "we make sure Mordrek's war, the real one, still coming, still needing to be fought, gets won honestly. And then we make absolutely certain this order never gets to manufacture another Nyx Corvellin or another version of me ever again." It was not, she understood, the ending the old prophecy had promised anyone. It was better. It was hers, but somewhere beyond the castle walls. In the deep ash-touched heart of the veiled forest, the true Mordrek, not manufactured chaos, but something far older and far more genuinely dangerous. Something Voss's 3 centuries of manipulation had only ever partially controlled and never fully understood, stirred at the sudden absence of the careful containment that had kept him leashed for 300 years, and began for the first time in 3 centuries to move freely toward Virelane on his own terms. News of Voss's exposure spread through Virelane faster than any royal decree in the kingdom's history, and the days that followed were, in their own way, more chaotic than the battle itself. The surviving Dawnwarden elders scrambled to control the narrative, some attempting to frame Voss as a singular corrupted anomaly rather than evidence of a systemic 300-year pattern. Others quietly resigning rather than face the questions Rowan's meticulously gathered records were now raising in every corner of the kingdom. Elira spent those days doing something she had never once managed in her first life. She rested. She let Petra and Finch handle the political maneuvering with the same tactical precision they'd brought to the battlefield. She let Rowan compile the historical record with the patient thoroughness of a man finally free to tell the whole truth after 30 years of careful, silent groundwork. She let Aldrich simply exist in the world again, watching him rediscover small pleasures, fresh bread, open sky, a horse's warm breath, with a tenderness that reminded her achingly of exactly what 300 years of stolen time actually costs a person. And she let herself, cautiously, tentatively, rebuild what remained of her friendship with Sira. "I keep thinking about the wedding," Sira admitted one evening, the two of them sitting together on the same castle wall they'd shared secrets from since childhood. "Not a real one, I mean. I keep having this strange feeling, like a memory that isn't mine, of standing beside Cale in front of a cheering crowd while you—" She stopped, frowning, unable to quite finish the thought. "It doesn't make sense. We haven't even won the war yet. Why do I keep imagining that?" Elira's breath caught, some old instinct urging her to deflect, to protect Sira from a truth that might frighten her further. She set the instinct aside deliberately, the way she'd learned to set aside every impulse that asked her to shrink herself for someone else's comfort. "Because in another version of this story," Elira said quietly, "that's exactly what happened. I gave everything to help Cale win his war. And at the end of it, he chose you instead in front of the entire cheering kingdom, while I died alone on a chapel floor no one thought to check." Sira went very still. "That's not possible. I don't fully understand it either," Elira admitted. "But I woke up 16 years in my own past with every memory of that life intact, and I decided I would rather change the story than live through that ending twice." Elira. Sira's voice was thick with an emotion that took Elira a moment to place correctly, not guilt, not quite, but a fierce protective grief on Elira's behalf that Elira hadn't expected and found, unexpectedly, deeply moving. "I would never, I don't even know if I have feelings for Cale in this life at all, but even if I did, I would never have wanted that. I would never have wanted you to disappear so quietly that no one even noticed." "I know that now," Elira said. "I don't think I fully understood it back then either. I think, in that other life, I was so busy trying to earn love by being useful that I never stopped to ask whether the people I was giving everything to actually deserved what I was giving them. And now." "Now," Elira said, looking out over the castle walls toward the distant, darkening line of the veiled forest, "I give what I choose to give to people who have actually earned it. You included, if you're willing to keep earning it the way you did in that council hall." Sira's laugh was watery but genuine, and she pulled Elira into a hug that felt, for the first time in either lifetime, entirely uncomplicated. It was 3 days later that Rowan brought the news that ended the brief peace entirely, scouting reports from the veiled forest's edge, describing ash corruption spreading faster and more violently than anything recorded in the war's previous years. Evidence unmistakable now that whatever Voss had spent 3 centuries carefully containing had finally slipped its leash entirely. "The true Mordrek," Rowan said grimly, spreading maps across the war council table where Elira, Cale, Sira, Aldrich, Petra, and Finch had gathered. Voss's manipulation kept a controlled, manageable version of the ash corruption active for 300 years, enough to justify the Order's existence, not enough to actually threaten the kingdom's survival. Without that careful containment, we're facing something considerably larger than anything your generation, or Nyx's, or any generation before you actually prepared for. How much time do we have?" Cale asked, and Elira noted with a small private satisfaction that his eyes went first to her rather than to any council elder for confirmation of the plan forward. "Days," Petra said grimly. "Perhaps a week if the containment wards Aldrich and I can construct hold as long as we're hoping. Then we fight," Elira said simply, "on our own terms this time, not a prophecy demanding a hero sacrifice while everyone else stands by cheering. A war fought by people who have chosen to stand together because they actually trust each other." not because some 300-year-old manipulator arranged the pieces to make it look inevitable. Kale's gaze held hers for a long moment across the war table, something steady and respectful passing between them that had nothing to do with the desperate, disoriented fascination he'd carried 2 years earlier. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly in front of everyone without flinching from the admission. "In whatever version of this story you lived before, I let a system convince me that loving you the way you deserved was somehow less important than loving whoever was simplest to love. I don't fully understand everything you've been through, Elira, but I understand enough to know that whatever role I play in this war, it needs to be beside you, as an equal, not above you, as someone waiting to be rescued. And not using you as someone whose devotion I take for granted until it's inconvenient." Elira held his gaze, feeling something loosen in her chest that she hadn't fully realized was still knotted there. Not romantic longing, not anymore, but a very old, very human need to hear. Once from the person who had failed her most completely, some genuine acknowledgement of exactly what that failure had cost. "Thank you," she said simply. "That's more than I ever got the first time. It's enough." It was, she realized with quiet surprise, actually enough. She did not need him to love her the way the old prophecy demanded. She needed, and had finally received, the simple dignity of being seen clearly by someone who had once looked straight through her. "Now," she said, turning back to the map spread across the table, the true war finally, unmistakably, arriving at Villain's doorstep. "Let's make sure whatever's coming out of that forest understands exactly what it's about to face." Outside, beyond the castle walls, the sky over the veiled forest had begun, for the first time in 300 years, to turn a deep and hungry black. The true Mordrek that finally emerged from the veiled forest bore little resemblance to the tales Elira had grown up hearing. No crowned demon king reveling in cruelty for its own sake, but something older and sadder than that, a vast ash-touched consciousness that had been trapped, contained, and quietly fed just enough freedom to remain a useful threat for 300 years without ever being allowed to fully exist or fully die. Voss's manipulation, Elira understood now, standing at the front of the assembled army on the battle's opening morning, had not created a monster. It had created a prisoner even older and even more thoroughly erased than Nyx or Aldrich, a being so long denied any identity beyond the threat that justifies the order that it had nearly forgotten it was capable of anything else. "We're not just fighting him," Elira said quietly to Kale, as the two of them stood shoulder to shoulder at the army's front line, the ash-black sky churning overhead. "We're freeing him too, the same way we freed Aldrich. The question is whether there's enough of whoever he used to be left to actually choose peace once the containment finally breaks. And if there is," Kale asked, "then we fight," Elira said simply. "But we fight together, honestly, without anyone pretending this is a single hero's destiny to bear alone." The battle that followed lasted the better part of a day, and it was unlike any battle recorded in either of Elira's lives. Not a single chosen sword against a single demon king, but an entire coalition of allies, each bringing their own hard-won strength to the fight. Kale's raw courage and increasingly disciplined swordsmanship, Aldrich's 3 centuries of perfected battle instinct, Petra's devastatingly precise Ashcourt theory turned into practical, protective magic, Finch's grim, focused fury channeled finally into something that felt like closure rather than empty vengeance. Sira, still untrained in combat but invaluable at the healer's lines, coordinating triage with a steady competence that surprised everyone who'd once dismissed her as merely sweet and simple. And Elira herself, wielding both the Shadow Court magic she'd spent 2 years mastering and the restorative healing gift she'd been born with, refusing at last to see the two halves of her power as separate, refusing to believe that being formidable and being kind had ever needed to be opposing choices. The turning point came in the battle's final hour, when Elira, badly wounded but still standing, finally reached the ash-touched core of Mordrek's vast, ancient consciousness and did something no version of this story in any life had ever attempted before. She did not attack, she healed. She poured every ounce of restorative magic she possessed, the same gift she'd once drained herself to nothing, pouring into an ungrateful hero, into the oldest wound she had ever encountered, a being who had been trapped, contained, and denied his own story for 3 centuries. Offering him not destruction but the same thing she had once desperately wanted for herself: acknowledgement, recognition, the simple, radical mercy of being seen clearly, finally, after centuries of being used as someone else's convenient monster. The vast ash-black consciousness shuddered, and for one suspended, impossible moment, the sky above Villain cleared entirely, revealing a sliver of ordinary, exhausted stars. "Thank you." Something ancient and grateful and finally free whispered directly into Elira's mind. In the last coherent thought it would ever manage to form before dissolving not into death, but into something closer to rest 300 years of stolen containment, finally mercifully releasing him into whatever came after. The ash corruption that had plagued Virelane for 3 centuries did not vanish overnight. The wounds of 300 years never heal in a single afternoon. But it stopped spreading, stopped growing, began instead the long, slow process of receding back into ordinary, unremarkable forest. No longer fed by anyone's careful manipulation. The war was won not with a hero's sacrifice, but with a mercy the old prophecy had never once considered necessary. The kingdom's celebration, when it finally came 3 days later, looked nothing like the one Elira remembered from her first life. There was no chapel ceremony crowning a single hero, while his forgotten healer bled out unnoticed in the corner. Instead, the celebration filled the great hall where Voss's 300-year deception had finally been exposed, and the crowd that gathered to celebrate did not gather around a single golden couple, but around an entire coalition of names the kingdom had for the first time in 3 centuries actually bothered to learn. Cale Ashbourne, Sword of Dawn, stood at the celebration center, but he did not stand alone accepting a crown that belonged partly to someone else's sacrifice. Beside him stood Elira Vance, Sierra Nightingale, Aldrich Thorne, Petra Amsel, and Finch Hollies. A coalition the surviving council, chastened and restructured under Rowan's careful new oversight, formally recognized in the Order's rebuilt records not as a hero's supporting cast, but as equal architects of the kingdom's survival. "There's something I want to say," Elira announced to the assembled crowd, stepping forward into the space that, in another life, had been reserved for a wedding proposal that erased her from history entirely. 300 years ago, a woman named Nyx Corvellan gave everything to save this kingdom and was sealed away for asking to be remembered for it. I found her journals. I read every word of her grief, her wisdom, her refusal to simply disappear quietly once she'd stopped being convenient. And I decided that her story deserved a different ending, even if it had to come 3 centuries too late to save her. She gestured toward Aldrich, standing tall and free beside her for the first time in 300 years. Her swordmaster is free. Her name is restored to every record the Order tried to erase it from, and the system that discarded her, generation after generation, has finally been exposed and dismantled. Elira's voice carried clear and steady across the hall, reaching every corner of a kingdom finally hearing the whole truth. I am not standing here today because a prophecy demanded my sacrifice. I'm standing here because I refuse to let my own story end the way hers did, forgotten, discarded, thanked only after it was too late for the thanks to mean anything. She looked toward Cale and toward Sierra, and felt something settle in her chest that was steadier and more honest than anything she'd felt in either lifetime. To anyone listening who has ever given everything to someone else's story and waited quietly to be noticed for it, Elira said. Her voice softening but losing none of its certainty, let this be the lesson history should have taught 300 years ago. Your worth was never something you had to earn through disappearing gracefully. It was always yours, whether or not anyone else remembered to say so. I would rather be known honestly, even as someone the old stories might have called a villain for refusing to stay quiet, than beloved for a silence that cost me everything and gave me nothing back. The hall erupted, not into the polite, performative celebration Elira remembered from her first life's ending, but into something rawer and more genuine, a kingdom finally, collectively, reckoning with 300 years of quiet cruelty it had never fully understood it was complicit in. In the weeks that followed, the rebuilt Dawnwarden Order formally established what the histories would eventually call the Ashville Accord, a permanent binding acknowledgement that every chosen one's companions, healers, and allies would be credited, compensated, and honored equally in every official record the kingdom kept from that day forward. Nyx Corvellan's name was carved at last into the same monument that had once celebrated Dorian Thale alone. Aldrich Thorne's name was carved beside hers. And beneath both of theirs, at Elira's own quiet insistence, a new inscription was added, not a prophecy, not a title, but a simple line she had written herself, in memory of a lesson 2 lifetimes had taught her the hardest possible way. No one's worth should require their own erasure to prove it. Elira Vance did not marry Cale Ashbourne. She did not need to. She built instead alongside Aldrich Petra Finch Rowan and against every prophecy's expectation her best friend Sierra. Something the old stories had never quite had a category for. Not a queen's throne inherited through romance or conquest, but a life entirely her own, respected rather than merely needed, remembered rather than merely useful. Somewhere in the rebuilt archive beneath the West Tower, Nyx Corvellan's journals now sat displayed openly rather than hidden in dust, a final entry added in Elira's own careful hand beneath the queen's last unfinished words. You asked once whether they would ever thank you properly. They didn't, not in your lifetime, but I found your story and I made sure it finally mattered. Sleep well, Nix, we're not villains. We were just the first ones brave enough to stop waiting quietly to be seen. The candle beside the journal burned steady, gold at its heart, no longer needing to turn black to prove its strength was real.